Let me briefly introduce our panel members and then set some context for the evening's conversation. And I will remind the panel to do what Trista just did with this one, which is to push the button so it turns green in front of us so we can do that. We have a wonderful group of people tonight who are giving their time and their thoughts and their expertise to this challenge in front of us, which is to engage fully as citizens in a time that asks a lot of us right now. What does it take to really be a fully engaged citizen in a soundbite era in the 21st century, and what may be one of the most challenging and volatile times politically, economically, and culturally that we've been through in quite a while? So joining us on the panel tonight is, on my far right, our Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, who's been engaged in building a strong democracy and citizenship in many different ways for a long period of time. I'm not going to go deeply into their bios because you have them in front of you. Next to Mark is Trista Harris, who I joke with her, but she does head the Headwaters Foundation for Justice. And my joke with her was she really is changing the face and the practice of philanthropy. And I love that title, Foundation for Justice. Quite strong, quite amazing. To my immediate left is one of our sponsors for the evening, Dana Mortenson, who created World Savvy, which, as you can tell by its name, implies a new sense of citizenship in a global community and the new responsibilities and knowledge that asks of us as well. And next is Jamal Thompson, Director of Education for the National Black MBA Association. And Jamal is himself a highly accredited engineer and a mechanical engineer at that. So we can expect precision, Jamal, from your remarks, I'm sure, this evening.
We'll work on that.
You'll work on that, he says. Excellent. And then another one of our hosts and sponsors this evening, President Brian Rosenberg, president of Macalester College. Macalester has long been known for its global responsibility, its global sense of citizenship. We know, for example, that one of the Secretary Generals of the United Nations is a Macalester graduate. And the last time I looked, Macalester said on its website that you had something like students from 90 different countries attending. I believe that's true, Brian?
Yes, it is.
Right. So a wonderful array of perspectives, knowledge, information, connections with us tonight. Now, for some panels, you might expect that we'd start at one end and everybody would give 5 minutes worth of ideas about citizenship. We're not doing that. They don't even know the first question that I'm going to throw out at them. And they're all ready for it anyhow, I can tell. So the first question in this context of a very challenging time, when what we call the experiment in democracy, which is, of course, something that Jefferson talked about and many others, this is truly an experiment in the sense that we're not done with it. It keeps asking more of us. We have to keep testing it. And the outcome is not certain. We cannot take our democracy for granted. It's not something that someone hands to us. It doesn't automatically occur. It's something that we build and create by our actions or inaction, by our knowledge, by our participation. It's not a given. And I think we can all be aware of times and voices when the practice of democracy might both seem too hard, or maybe a particular strong man or group of people knows best of all how to run this crazy, mixed-up world that we're living in. And democracy is just a little too difficult, uncertain, and who can trust the masses of people out there anyhow? Aren't they kind of busy watching TV and being entertained and shopping at the Mall of America? Challenges and responsibilities. So the first question I'd like to pose to our panel tonight is the following. At this moment, right now, what does citizenship in the USA ask of us? What does being a full citizen ask that we know and be able to do? And I'd like to just toss that out for anybody who'd like to pick it up.
And before you pick it up, can I be asked to tell you the panelists need to push the button on your microphone so it goes green?
Green.
So that you can be heard.
Yep.
And David, if you could move yours a little closer, we're having a little trouble hearing you in the back.
You're having trouble hearing me in back? We'll correct that. Thanks very much. We'll do that. And if you can't hear or if it's muddy, just wave a hand and we'll make sure the mics are close to you. What does citizenship now ask of us in this very challenging time? Who would like to pick that up? Mark, please.
When I was graduating from high school, I couldn't vote because it was a 21-year. 21 was the age for becoming an adult. And I can remember a lot of the organizing and the discussions about the denial of the right to vote and the whole organizing to change that. And I can remember even at that time thinking that what's actually demanded and required of those of us privileged to have been born a citizen of this country is very little. But the gifts that we've received because of that being born privileged in this way demand an incredible amount from us. And there's a huge gap that takes a kind of ethical training or moral or values training to help us find a way to narrow that gap. Our children get quite a few gifts because they're born into our families. And we, at some point, start to have expectations that they contribute in a way, whether it's the chores or all those kinds of things. And so we struggle to narrow that gap, probably. Some of you, of course, were perfect parents, no problem with that. Some of us probably struggled a little more. But my impression is that we're at a time of exploration about the gap between what is actually required and what is demanded because of the gifts that we've received. And I would just simply say, from my perspective, those demands are first to be aware of and appreciative and acknowledge publicly the gifts of the democracy, of this beautiful school, of this beautiful place. Second, to be faithful in our stewardship and care of those gifts, fix the roof if the roof leaks, or take care of the oceans if the oceans need taken care of. And then finally, to be investing in the future so that those who come behind us have the same blessings of gifts that we've received, that narrowing the gap between what we are required or expected or demanded of us in terms of citizenship and what we really owe those who come before us, I think can be addressed by being able to be thoughtful about how we remember the past, the present, and the future.
Mark, thank you very much. Who else would like to jump in on that one?
Well, I will. First of all, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to Macalester. There are many different ways to answer that question, as you know, and I will focus on two. When the democracy of which you speak was founded, two of its founders, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, did something very important in addition to creating the democracy we live in, and that is that both founded among the first institutions of higher education in America. Benjamin Franklin founded what went on to become the University of Pennsylvania, and Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. And they did that because both believed that democracy was impossible without an educated citizenry. And so one of the expectations, it seems to me, of all of us living in a democracy is a certain level of engagement and education. That does not mean that in order to have a democracy, everyone needs to go to college. It does not mean that everybody has to have the same level of educational attainment. It does mean we need to make education accessible to all of our citizens. And it does mean that as citizens we have a responsibility to be informed and engaged enough so that we can understand and participate in that democracy. The other quality that I would emphasize, and I think this is both underemphasized and sorely lacking today, is civility. I think civility is more than simple politeness. Civility is a prerequisite for a functioning democracy. Because what civility really means is the ability to listen, the ability to respond with respect to the views of others, to engage in constructive processes with others, even when there are differences of opinion, to show generosity and to show trust. And I think one of the qualities that is essential to a democracy that we have, I think, in fact, lost sight of is civility.
Trista, would you like to respond to that?
I think responsible citizenship is about leaving the world a better place than you found it. And it's about having a standard that's higher than just what you need for yourself. Being a citizen means that you're a part of a network, you are part of a community, and you're part of a nation. And there's work that we're doing together. I think too often we think of citizenship as something that has benefits, as Mark said, and we don't think about the hard work that it takes and the sacrifice that's necessary for us to be a strong nation together, both as a country and as a global citizen as well.
Trista, thank you. And just a quick linkage of a couple of threads here. There is a sense, listening to Mark and Brian and Trista, there's a sense in here that it's not enough for a citizen to claim rights. There's a sense that we have obligations to each other, to something larger than ourselves. Mark said to the future, a kind of stewardship and investing in the future. Brian talks about our need, if you will, to engage in a constructive process, which I think suggests that we're doing something together, that we're creating something together. And Trista, you imply and say exactly the same thing, that we have an obligation, if you will, not just a right, but an obligation to leave the world a little better than when we discovered it or came into it ourselves. So I just want to call out some of the themes that are emerging a little bit. Dana, did you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to add a layer to that. I think it's great that the focus is on, we tend to be very rights focused, which is great, but really thinking about citizenship in contemporary society is about that emphasis on responsibility, which I think is terrific. But I also wanted to layer into that the context in which we're developing citizens in the 21st century in the United States, and how critical global competency has really become. I was trying to pick just one stat to emphasize how ethnically and culturally diverse our communities are becoming wherever we are in the United States, and what that really does is means that we're broadening the set of stakeholders that have something to say about what does it mean to leave the world a better place, and for whom and how and who's involved, and what voices are included and what voices are left out of that. And the stat I pulled, because I thought it was fascinating, is that 82% of the population growth between 2005 and 2050 are going to come from new immigrants to the U.S. and their children and grandchildren, 67 million and 50 million respectively. So if you think about that in terms of the implications for how broad, what that means about the sort of how our communities are actually, who they're comprised of, and what those interests represent, and what kind of investment they have, it's certainly something that I think needs to be on the table as we consider evolving not just a skill set, but defining what engagement looks like in that new terrain.
You zipped those numbers by pretty quickly. Would you mind saying them one more time?
Yeah, it's 82% of the population growth in the United States between 2005 and 2050 will come from new immigrants to the U.S. and their children and grandchildren over that period of time, which is pretty amazing. So.
That is a pretty amazing number. And of course, it's happening in Minnesota right now, where we sit, the incredible diversity of the population. If you have not recently walked through a public school, you need to walk through and visit a public school because, my friends, the future is here now. And we're either educating them well or we're not. That's a separate panel, I believe. It's a different conversation. Jamal, I invite your perspective on this question.
Thanks, Dave. I'd say that the first thing that somebody should do when trying to decide how to give back or how to be a citizen, a good corporate citizen, or just a well-rounded person, is to first identify who it is that your community is and who it is you're going to support and help develop and push to the next level. Then to figure out how you're going to go about doing it. We talked about diversity in the schools. You think beyond just that and the availability of technology to students. I mean, it's one thing to walk into a classroom, but the reality is you can turn on a computer today and push a button and talk to somebody in China, talk to somebody in India. And, the face of diversity is changing in our schools. It's changing in the workplace. The days of predominantly white workplaces are fast shrinking.
Right.
And as citizens, in this country, we have to teach those that are coming behind us how to work in diverse workplaces. I think it's really important to understand that languages and having our students know multiple languages is highly important. Mm-hmm. Spanish, Chinese, what have you. English is a very commonly spoken language, but it is not the only spoken language in the world, and probably I'd put money on it. It's not the most commonly spoken language in the world. There's how many billion people in China?
Mm-hmm. About 6.
Yeah. All right, so where's your? You got to put your heart into where you want to give back to your community. Define who that community is, then elevate them to that next level, and chart your path, and just go out and execute and do it. Find an organization to volunteer for, create your own, or what have you.
But you raised some interesting questions that are kind of embedded in the title "Citizenship in a Soundbite Era" in a way. You touch on 2 things, Jamal, that I think are challenging to us. One is the technology itself provides a lot of information, but sometimes in tiny little segments, and it's just hard to grab it, make sense out of it. It's moving very fast. I think somebody was saying at one point, the news cycle is 24 hours, although it kind of feels like 24 minutes. Sometimes somebody's the leader in the primary race for a certain office, and it seems like a few minutes later they're not the leader anymore, and then whatever. But also the sense that we are now part of a global community raises the question for us, though. So what is it? What are we a citizen of? What is our community, if you will? Does being able to talk instantly to somebody in China or pick any other nation, does that somehow dilute or lessen our capacity to be a citizen of a state, Minnesota, or a nation, the United States, or something? What is the effect of this sort of global networking? Does it pull us away from a feeling of belonging, of community, of stewardship, to go back to Mark's observation? Just how do you all see that? Dana, I know you think about this a lot, so you want to take a run at that?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's, I'll be brief and let others kind of jump in, but I think it's human nature to sort of, that people will always feel some connection to people in their closest, most inner circle. I mean, then that's very natural. It's very logical, and it's conducive to the kind of stewardship and connections within communities that make sense. And so that will always be defined. Things like family, things like neighborhood, immediate community. I think the interesting thing about, to not go too far down the road of how what technology's really done is lowered the barriers for the kinds of discussions that Jamal is referencing. But the interesting thing about what it does, I was looking into some studies in preparation for tonight to test some of my assumptions, because I think we all have assumptions about, well, it's there, so students are talking with students in China every day, and this is what they're doing, but access to information and the ability, or access to networks and the ability to process that information and or meaningfully engage in those networks are 2 very different things. And what a lot of the trends are showing, particularly among youth, is that there's sort of this there's a friendship-driven connections online, which is basically an extension of their circles that they already maintain. In school, in community, and then there's interest-driven, where it gives sort of new opportunities for people, if they're interested in something specialized, to dive in and to find a community that isn't geographically bound to enhance that kind of skill set. So I think with respect to how we define ourselves and our community, I don't think, I see it as a vehicle and a tool. And the way that I view diversity is really, I think it's often discussed as something that is a challenge to be sort of navigated as opposed to a gift to be leveraged, because diversity really does result in, we've had this discussion before, you can learn more and see more. And so the idea that you might be able to see an application of a solution to a problem or an approach to something else from a broader network than only your immediate neighborhood, could in my mind just be a benefit to thinking about how to apply that to how you might be able to address things that are happening more locally. But I think it's natural that I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think you can still have an affinity and a connection to your local community while being a member of a global community and really defining yourself as such.
Hopefully not mutually exclusive, because it is the world we're living in,
Right.
I think increasingly so. Brian, do you have a perspective on this?
I think I would take it even further and say that the extent to which we are now globally interconnected actually makes local responsibility more important. We talk a lot about global citizenship at Macalester, and we always talk about it as in effect a series of layers. Global citizenship really means local citizenship, it means national citizenship, it means transnational citizenship. And I really do believe that unless you develop the habits of how to behave with the people who are immediately around you, with the people who are in your own community, it is highly unlikely that you will be a responsible citizen of the world. And so the message that we try to deliver to our own students and our own community is think about the community that you live in, think about the community that surrounds the college, develop the right habits, the right ways of thinking, the right ways of interacting in those communities, and then try to carry those good habits into your interactions with communities that are more far-flung and diverse. But I actually think that interconnectedness makes local responsibility more important.
Interesting.
I would say that we don't have the luxury to not be global citizens. The issues that we face and the impact that we're having is a global impact. And issues like immigration are something that are seen as a global issue, but when you look in our school systems, there are immigrants and children of immigrants that are working in the schools every single day. So I think for a long time in the United States particularly, we have really turned a blind eye to our role in the world. It felt like there was enough going on here that we didn't need to pay attention to what was happening in the broader context. And it's been very clear, especially in the last couple of years, how tightly bound we are when it comes to economics, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to some of the natural disasters that have impacted the world and have had an impact in the United States, that we can't turn a blind eye to our role anymore.
Jamal.
Yeah, I'd say corporations today are spreading out. They're spreading into new countries, into new markets. I'm sorry. Okay. Corporations today are spreading out. They're spreading out into new markets, into new countries, and developing, new technologies to serve those places. One of the things that Cummins is hard on right now is how do we develop products specific for the market that we're selling them in. Okay.
And name some of those other markets that Cummins is in.
China, India. We're now exploring into Africa and trying to figure out, how you tackle the continent of Africa. I mean, most people think of Africa as just one country, but when you really think about it, there's I think 54 different countries in Africa, and they all have different cultures, and you have to approach how you sell a product in that country differently than you do in any other country in the world. And so, in order for our next generation to be successful, they have to fully understand all of the caveats, the
cultures.
the cultures. Beyond that, the pieces, the little bits and pieces that make up all those cultures, to truly understand how to work within those regions of the country, and of the world rather. So, once again, just broaden the horizons of every person you meet, because
let's bring these two things together for a moment, because thank you. Is this better? Right to my mouth. Closer.
All the rest of you closer.
All right.
In the back is
Okay, sorry. Let's bring these two pieces together. Just the reality that we're living in a global economy, global culture, but also what Brian said, that we need to practice civility along the lines that Dana was saying, with the people that we literally are with on a regular basis, school, work, family, neighborhood, whatever it is. Are we practicing civility? Are we helping build those skills of a generous appreciation of each other, of being able to disagree but in a civil way, of coming to some kind of common stewardship of things that matter to all of us? Are we practicing this? What would you say, panelists, to that right now? What state do we seem to be in building these civil skills, if you will, to navigate this incredibly diverse and complicated world? Mark?
Well, I was thinking about the larger institutions. I mean, we're into a little bit stereotyping and kind of broad sweep. I don't mind doing that. I'm just aware of it. Mm-hmm. But my experience is that two big segments of our society have really tackled this question of diversity, making their organizations closer to our whole society. It's large-scale business and our armed services. The two who failed, although talked about it, is our churches and our colleges and universities. And I don't know all the reasons about why one is successful, one unsuccessful. That might be worth looking at. But in the middle, then, are other sectors who've struggled with this. Nonprofit sector, the public employment sector, media. I think maybe there's some lessons in that process. I've been taken a little bit by Michelle Norris's book, where it's about her path of trying to discuss and understand issues of race, and then writing it up in a book that's now become a kind of a touch point or a kickoff point, in that conversation. But anyhow, one of the things that's most impressive in that book is her cold calling family and descendants and sure tell relatives of white police from Birmingham who were involved in an incident with her father. I don't want to give away the book, but anyhow, she had a lot of courage to get on the phone, make these calls, and then some people had the courage then to have the conversation. So courage and the way that certain values-driven behavior then can elicit courageous and value-laden or value-informed response is one of those upward spirals. And so I feel like in the context of incivility, and I've had my own share of experiences to reflect on, but generally my experience is that when people engage in a civil way and in a respectful way and in a courageous way with folks, they get that kind of feedback loop back. And so that's the part that when I get up in the morning, it's it's going to be a good day because of that.
Great.
I'll be a little bit of the contrarian today. I think the problem, especially in Minnesota, is that we're too civil. We have this Minnesota nice thing, which means that we refuse to talk about the problems that our community faces. I think that Minnesota nice causes the racial disparities that we see in our school system, where teachers say, it must be so hard for you, student of color. I'm going to set the bar here for you. Mm-hmm. And so I think civility is critical. I think it's completely missing from a lot of sectors. But I think that some of the issues that we're facing, we have to move away from the politeness and move to action. Otherwise, we're never going to see the change that we need to see in our community.
I don't think that would be too contrarian, just to build on that for just a moment, because it's not, I think we need to distinguish between the, the incredible Minnesota passiveness, if you will, the politeness that masks the fact that some people will not do what Mark was talking about, have the courage to speak to something that is very, very difficult indeed. And I liked, Mark, that you brought up that word courage. I think to go from where we are to where we need to be, that will take some courageous actions from each of us to speak to and act upon things that are pretty challenging to act upon. Dana.
I'm sort of kind of to build off both of what you both said. I'm not sure that civility is definitely a key to it, but we're not very good at building consensus, and we don't often reward compromise. I mean, if you think about the political climate in the United States right now, when decisive action isn't taken or when an interest group doesn't get exactly what they want out of it, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, people aren't happy about compromise. And the tone and the dialogue has been anything but civil at lots of levels in government. And so I think it's a question too of how we think about setting up structures to incentivize might be the wrong word, but how do you reward that dialogue? How do you honor the outcomes of what civil dialogue can create and point out and highlight when consensus really does achieve a better outcome for a greater number of people rather than few? So it occurs to me because when I think about what I hear on the news now, regardless of the issue that's discussed, it is oftentimes much less about the facts of the issue, and so we are encouraging people to dig less deeply and think less critically about the issues, but lots of people can tell you what other people think about them in a soundbite, whether it's healthcare or immigration or anything else. And so I think there's something to be said for how we think about how we're modeling that at all different levels, and I think that's important. I think the skill of building consensus is something that is kind of missing.
Well, and it goes again, can you hear me in the back okay?
Use the mic.
It goes again to that question of where do we practice civility? Where do we practice it, broadening it from civility, but where do we practice building consensus? How does it get rewarded? We can't take it for granted. So Jamal or Brian, I'd like you to jump in on this. Global company, Jamal, and literally one of the great liberal arts colleges, Brian. How do we practice these skills that we need to be literally responsible and effective and even courageous citizen right now?
I'll tell you guys a bit of a story. This just recently happened.
Right
I
up
guess
there.
got to hold it like right in my mouth, sticking in my cheek. I recently, at Cummins, I lead a group called the Multi-Ethnic Affinity Group, and basically our mission is to try and find ways to leverage our cultural differences to help the business grow and do different things. So this past weekend, I took my team to an event that was hosted by the Minnesota Black Chamber of Commerce. It was a scholarship dinner, and we in my team I've got a young man who's from the Sudan. I've got a woman here from Minnesota, and I have a couple people that are from India. And at the opening of the dinner, we stood up and we sung the Black National Anthem. Mm-hmm. By show of hands, how many of you have ever even heard of that song? Okay, that's good. That's okay. None of them knew what it was. They didn't have a clue. And so I sat there and I began educating them on why that song is, why people sing that, why we sing that song at events like this, and how it relates back to our heritage. And I'd say that one of the most important things anybody can do is to educate those around you on your culture, and on top of that, to open up yourself to be accepting to what they have to tell you about theirs. It's a two-way street, communication, mm-hmm. and if you open your ears and listen and share from your experiences as well, you'll find that it's a lot easier to come to that consensus because you'll be able to understand where they're coming from, and they'll be able to understand where you're coming from. So, see that.
I want to return to a comment I made earlier because I'm a little bit concerned that we're conflating two different ideas, and that is civility and politeness. Mm-hmm. When I refer to civility, I don't refer to politeness. I refer to a concept that's deeper and more pervasive. There's a book by Stephen Carter called On Civility. Stephen Carter is a professor of law and religion at Yale. And in that book, he says that the essence of civility is generosity when there is difference and trust when there is risk. And it seems to me that those concepts run much deeper than simply being polite to someone else.
Exactly.
If we are living in a time right now of successful civility, I would hate to see what failure looks like. I think we are living in an extraordinarily uncivil time in our public discourse, not in our interactions with one another on a personal level. I don't think, for the most part, that people on a one-on-one basis or within their families treat one another with less civility, with less consideration, with less generosity and trust than they used to. In our public discourse, in our political discourse, in our media discourse, absolutely. I think that as a parent, when I think about the most important ways that I teach my children, it's through my own behavior. It's through modeling. I can say whatever I want, I can lecture about whatever I want, but if I don't model the right kinds of behavior, then I'm going to be delivering the wrong kinds of lessons. And what concerns me deeply is that I think that we are delivering in our public discourse and through many of our leaders exactly the wrong kinds of messages to our children about how to behave and interact with one another. Somebody said to me a couple of days ago, and I think this is a brilliant phrase, but he said we have turned anger into a commodity. Anger is now what we trade in. It's what sells. It doesn't matter where you're coming from, what your perspective is, who you're angry at. The key is that you're angry. And that's what people are interested in, and that's the way people engage with one another on a public stage. I won't say it's the worst moment for this in American history. In the 19th century, members of Congress used to beat one another with a stick. So it's not as if we can claim any particular historical uniqueness here. But it is not a good moment right now for the kind of public discourse in our political processes and in our media that we need in order to develop a different and more responsible level of citizenship on a local or a global level.
If I could just piggyback on something
you
said.
Yes.
Because, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name. Trista mentioned, she said something about the...
Can you hear him?
Can you guys hear me?
Right up there. Swallow it. And a little louder. There you go.
Okay, now you can hear me. All right. So we were just talking about the fact that back in the day, people used to solve issues by clubbing each other, and Trista was talking about the Minnesota Nice, and the face of civility has changed clearly over time, and it will continue to change. And civility today, Minnesota Nice is one thing here in the state, but Minnesota Nice is everywhere. It's just called something different. It takes a different name, but it's the exact same thing. So, how do we break that boundary, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do we not step back and pass judgment on the next person, but instead open up to that person and learn something about them and elevate yourself to the next level?
Yep. One of the questions I posed to the panel was, where do we practice this? So if we describe a time that's challenging and difficult, and I think many of us would agree with what Brian just said on this, and Mark, you alluded to it, but you're living in the middle of one of the most contentious legislative sessions, House, Senate, and divided within each one that we've had, I think, in a very, very long period of time, and you're navigating some very, very rough waters. Where do we practice, Dana, what you referred to is rewarding compromise, rewarding this kind of generosity of spirit, if you will? The Humanities Center is dedicated to this. That center is dedicated to the future of our state. The Humanities Center is dedicated to finding what we hold in common not what divides us. We got an array of programs that address that. That is one way. Our institutions need to address this, and they need to address them with courage. I think we can't wait for somebody else to do this at this stage. Just, I'd like to turn to you for a moment and just tell us a little bit about why you have a program that's dedicated to justice. Where does that taking you? Just because it sounds to me like you're addressing some of the very challenges and issues that we're naming right here. Would you speak to that for a moment, please?
The Headwaters Foundation for Justice is a community foundation that was founded about 27 years ago, and our purpose is to eliminate some of the systemic inequalities that we have throughout the state of Minnesota, and we do that by funding community organizing. And one of the things that I was thinking about in context of this conversation was the idea that young people are really a group that can teach all of us about citizenship and engagement and what that looks like. We often come from the place of let's teach young people how to be citizens, but as you look at the uprisings that have happened throughout the Middle East and the Occupy movement that's happening in the United States now, it's young people that are most impacted by the inequality that we see. They're hurt the most by it, and they're going to deal with it the longest. And so they're in a really unique position to work on change in that area. And, you know, I know for Headwaters, one of the really interesting conversations that we've had, we normally support 501c3 nonprofit organizations that are doing community organizing. Sometimes we'll fund groups that don't have a C3 status and that sort of thing. So we've always been a really flexible funder when it comes to this work. But the Occupy movement is something that caught all of us off guard. They're talking about the same things that our grantees have been talking about for 10 years, but we don't recognize any of them. And so it puts you in a weird position as a funder. And we had a really interesting conversation with our board where I said that I had recently read an article about foundations during the 1960s, and who were the foundations that said no when Martin Luther King asked for money to fund the civil rights movement. And that's not the grant application that I want to have with like my name and the big denied stamp on it. And my concern was that that's the same, you never know what the future is going to look like. And as young people organize in a different way than we're used to seeing and are pushing for a different sort of change than we're used to seeing, it's very easy to be on the wrong side of history. So for us, it's been about opening up the idea of what this looks like and what could be accomplished and who's a part and who's not a part of it. Because I think too often the pretty package and what things look like on television and what are the talking points and what are the 5 bullet points are what we're all looking for. But what we actually need is those larger systemic changes that are more permanent. And those are much more murky and they're confusing, and we don't know what this wave is going to look like when it's over. So we hold on really, really tight. And the longer that you hold on to a wave, the more likely it is that you're going to get squished at the bottom of it. But if you jump onto the next wave, you're more likely to be ahead of that progress. So I think that's been a big challenge as we're thinking about what justice is going to be like in the future. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how all of this is going to end. But I know that if you support people that are excited, engaged, and want to make the country a better place, you can't go wrong.
Larger systemic changes are really scary for big institutions, and I think we can also acknowledge that a lot of institutions aren't delivering what we need to have happen right now. So there's quite a challenge going on, and to your point, Trista, that change is coming at us from directions that no one could have predicted and no one is controlling. I did see this great cartoon the other day, one of those guys with the long robe, New Yorker cartoon, which I love, guy with the long robe holding up a sign saying, "The end is near." And somebody said to him, "Yes, but what are your goals?" Which has been the critique, of course, of the Occupy whatever movement, you know. They're about something that is profound and dramatic and full of energy, and people have critiqued them because, well, what are your goals really? Well, their goals are deep systemic change. So, Dana, looks like you want to jump in on this. Are you for or against systemic change?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry.
I had a thought as Brian and Trista were talking, because I think it's this idea of practicing civility, and also in the context of doing that in a soundbite era, is I see this in education, that we are trying to move out of this modality where there is a right answer to the problems and the issues we face, and most often there isn't. That it's really about getting comfortable with complexities and with gray areas, and this idea. I love the idea of it's generosity when there's difference, and it's trust when there's risk. What's implied in that is that the right answer is a very relative concept. The right answer for whom, in what circumstances, under what conditions. And I think in the context of education, that's not something that we're typically training. Right. We're not always training people to think in that way, because in order to be able to be generous when there's difference, you have to be less solidified and crystallized in a position that's been embedded into your way of thinking for whatever reason. And that's not something you see a whole lot. And to bring it back to sort of what's happening in political discourse, the right answer, people hold firmly, it's for or against, it's this or it's that, it's right or it's wrong, it's good or it's evil. And so many things in this world, and so many of the issues we're facing as citizens in what is really a complex terrain, is so far from the reality. So I think I just wanted to introduce that as, don't have the answer to it, but one of the challenges, and just thinking about how do you re-educate people to be thinking in that way, so they can apply it to whatever that means to practice civility as a citizen of this kind of diverse space.
And you, in your work with World Savvy, are addressing the question of how, which is what's on the table in front of us right now. If we have a world where too much of the time it's black, white, up, down, in, out, this is the right, that's the wrong answer, and so forth, we know that doesn't work very well. But to build on what Brian said a little bit, we've turned anger into a commodity. We've turned rigid positions into the highest value, if you will. There was recently, in our own state capital, a hearing that was held. The title of the hearing was, "Should Conservative People Ever Compromise? If so, why?" I'm not making this up. That was the actual title. Should we even consider compromising? As if that's really a question in a democratic society. It was a serious question, and there was debate in the room as to whether that was a good idea or not. So I just offer that, it's a real story, as a suggestion of how far we may have to go to practice civility. Mark.
Well, I want to take us back 150 years to the soundbite of democracy, and the person who was most famous for insisting on democracy was Stephen Douglas in his debates with Lincoln. And he took an issue that some might argue should not be the subject of compromise, which was slavery. So I might challenge your dismissal of debating compromise a little bit. But anyhow, Douglas said...
What? Did I dismiss debate and compromise? I did not.
I think you were being dismissive of discussing when you should compromise and when you should not. Is that fair?
No.
I think we should have a debate.
Let me listen with greater civility, though, right?
Stephen Douglas argued that the slavery question could just be settled with compromise. No, with democracy in Kansas. Let's vote on it.
Yeah.
Some people want to settle the question of marriage in Minnesota with democracy. Let's vote on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about the country and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is that it's not about the power we gave an institution. It's about the power we retained as individuals on basic rights. So 150 years ago, we had real incivility, and we had a war as a result of a whole series of compromises that sort of didn't really work out, and then ultimately the only possibility and the way that people chose to walk by foot thousands of miles and give their life or limb for an ideal and for a vision is a remarkable thing. But the way in which the soundbite of that moment of democracy and voting in Kansas and the whole outcome of bloody Kansas and all that, and Harper's Ferry ultimately, I mean, we can take some lessons from that period, from what it was like then. But it leaves us with the situation of today, because if you just take the history and stack it up, that's one thing. But say, okay, but what's our heritage? Not all of the events that make up our history, but what's our heritage? I think we inherit a heritage that's pretty amazing and has the possibility of this kind of conversation. Mm-hmm. Even in cold weather, it's pretty nice inside of here. And we have the possibility of so many other things because, we've been generously blessed by others. So here we are. Tonight we have a chance to talk about where does that citizenship take us in the next phase. Mm-hmm. Lots of people would like to vote on some rights. Right to vote, they want to put on the ballot. Right to marriage, want to put on the ballot. Right to, vote in the legislature on taxes. Right to organize. You go down the list. Mm-hmm. So it allows us to say, maybe democracy is a more complex thing, and gives us a chance to talk about, what was really in the democracy and in the Constitution.
And you bring up some great points, which is part of, it seems to me, the responsibility of citizenship is understanding, in fact, how representative government really works. Because if we had left votes to some of the things that you're talking about, whether slavery should exist in certain states or not at certain times, we know what the popular vote would have been. And there's a whole lot of folks that had no right to vote at all. So I think you're making some critical points. So it does seem to me that one of the attributes of being a citizen is understanding how, in fact, representative government really works and your role in it, and then to take that role and not let it lay somewhere else. I think we've all been struck sometimes by lines miles long of people finally getting the right to vote in the Sudan, for example, and some of the low voter turnouts in some of our own national and even state elections, although Minnesota is often ranked fairly highly. So we have a responsibility as a citizen to understand what rights are retained by the individual and cannot be taken away by a popular vote. Mark, which I think is the point that you're making. How does our government in fact work? If you don't know that, how can you play an effective role then? To the point that several of you made, whether it's locally effective as a citizen or globally or beyond. So there is some sense in which we need to know just some of the facts about what elected representative government in fact means and how that works out. Let me turn this a little more open now. We've touched on a couple of things that we could go on. Of course, this is a challenging and complicated question. But are there, in fact, some things that we can do? Are there some actions that we can take now that address some of the challenges that have been named? Is there a way to practice civility in the way that Brian talks about it? Is there a way to open our hearts, our minds more generously in the way that Jamal has talked about it? Is there a way to respond beyond the normal structures in the ways that Trista has talked about it? What can we do? Are there actions that you would suggest or name that we can in fact take? And I'm asking this for all of you to think about as well. We're going to open this up for some discussion. I think there are cards on tables, Charmaine, is that true? If you want to write down a question, and we'll pass among you with the microphone in a little while. But Dana, if I can put you on the spot, because in fact you're on the spot with World Savvy anyhow, doing some great things. What can we do that builds the kind of courage and openness and civility and knowledge that we've been talking about for a bit? And I'd like the other panelists to think about that as well, some actions that we can take.
Sure. I think World Savvy does this work, but there's a lot, this movement has been active. Mark, you and I have talked about this in character education and some of these, I think the ecosystem in the space we work in K-12 education, there's a lot that can contribute to it. I think what we need to rethink in the context of building good citizens and engaged citizens in the 21st century is what does the job of K-12 education or post-secondary
Keep that close to
really
your mouth.
become in that context. And I think a lot of that is helping to look at what do we need to be able to encourage that kind of discourse to help people practice civility. And a lot of it is transitioning the set of skills that students need to be more engaged citizens locally and globally. And that's communication, cross-cultural communication. Jamal touched on the need for that. Collaboration. I mean, if you think about the range of issues that face communities locally, but anywhere now, there are very few of them that can be solved by a single entity, whether that's one organization, one government. It's really working in collaboration with lots of others. So really placing students into a context where they're actively practicing collaboration with students that have different backgrounds. I think that's pretty important. Problem solving is another big one, and helping to students now, the barriers are so low for them to access information. We talked about that. But to take that one step further and create a context in schools where critical thinking is sort of a key element of it. So to move out of a modality where there's a right and a wrong answer, you're studying knowledge and regurgitating it, or teaching to the test, which I think is a big problem. And there's no argument with standards. There's no argument with understanding outcomes. But the reality is that if we're teaching knowledge to students today, the half-life of information and of that knowledge is shrinking every day. And what they really need to know how to do is what to do with knowledge they're taking in, not memorize a bunch of facts that will be irrelevant in the years to come. And I think encouraging them to know how to ask questions and learn independently. And I think there's a lot of tools available in schools and there's some really positive things are shifting. The use of technology can aid in that, but also sort of shifting the content of how we teach and what we make available.
Great. Yes?
I think Dana's onto something, because we've really built an education system that is often based on memorization. It's preparing kids for working in factories, that sort of thing, where it's just not the skill sets that they're going to need to be able to do the work that we need in the 21st century. I get most excited about how free information is coming. It used to be decided by a few people, and if you paid a lot of money and you were in this special college or secret society, you got the information. But now there's collaboratively developed information. So I think of Wikipedia compared to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's a joke amongst my parents that, you've got people that just make up information and they can put it on the internet, and all these kids are using it for their school papers. But there's been a ton of studies that have been done that the information on Wikipedia is truer than what you see in hardbound encyclopedias, because information is changing so quickly, and because you have an entire community of people that are working together to double check each other's work. If somebody puts up that, I'm the Queen of England, somebody else is going to change it in 10 minutes. And I think that's the real power of knowledge being free and of knowledge being shared by so many people, because we get the best thinking of everybody. The very specific things that can be talked about on Wikipedia, you'd never have an encyclopedia that's 20,000 volumes big, because it's not cost effective to do it. So we've lowered these cost barriers to information, and now it's teaching kids the critical thinking skills so that they know what's good information and what isn't.
So Wikipedia is in fact an exercise in building democracy, would you say? Yes. Very interesting. Other comments on how we can practice, Brian, the skills we need to address the challenges that you've named for us?
Well, I'm always tempted to talk first, about education.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to talk about education, most research suggests that the earlier the better, so early childhood education. But I actually want to go a little bit deeper. I think if you scratch beneath the surface of most of the systemic challenges that we face in education and job creation, what you get at pretty quickly is income inequality. If you look at what's happened to incomes over the last 50 or 60 years, since about 1960, the real income of the lowest 20% of this country has not changed. Has not changed at all. And you have to go into about the 60th percentile before you really get meaningful change. And as long as that income inequality persists and gets wider, and it's gotten wider since the recession hit, it is very, very difficult to address all of the other systemic things we need to address to prepare children to be better citizens. It's very hard to talk to a child about being a better citizen when that child is struggling with the ability to go to a reasonable school or the ability to have a nourishing meal. And so my own view is that somehow, and it's someone described it at another meeting today that I was at like trying to boil the ocean, but somehow we have to get at this root challenge of income inequality, which has created massive divides and challenges in all of our systems, really. I think if we're going to affect change, and I think you have to start small. You can't tackle the big problem. And so I think in the area of education, I think you could try to work on making education better and more accessible to a larger and more diverse set of students. But what I find in virtually any public policy issue that I think about is that you run up against income inequality pretty quickly.
And the income inequality, can you hear me? The income inequality issue translates directly into our schools. Our schools in the United States are not nearly ranked the highest in the world. I don't know which country is the highest, but I know that Japan is leaps and bounds beyond us. The education systems in Europe are leaps and bounds beyond us. And you look at our school systems, and I mean the disparity from even a public school that's in a neighborhood that's well off, as compared to that of a public school that's in a lower income neighborhood, are enormous. And I mean, it hasn't changed. It's been like that forever. And when I was in high school, it was like that. My mother works in the education system. She made it a point to get us out of the school system, out of the schools that were in the poorest performing neighborhoods, put us in schools that were on the higher end, so we get better education and be better prepared for college. And when I went to school in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
And I went to Howard University. I don't know if you all have heard of that. It's a predominantly African American university, and the disparity of students coming in as freshmen in college is tremendous. I mean, I took AP classes in high school, and the AP classes I was offered in high school were far beyond the ability of the AP classes of the students who went to high school in lower income neighborhoods. So we talk about democracy and
But are you? But I'm interested in what we can do. So, are you in fact addressing this now in your own leadership capacity? And I know that education is one area that you are leading in the Professional Association of Black MBAs, right? So you're looking at this. Yep. Name an action that you're taking there, Jamal.
So as my role within the National Black MBA Association is Director of Education, and we have responsibility for this program called the Leaders of Tomorrow. And our sheer focus is to develop high school students that come from lower income areas and are minorities for college. And we provide them tools that they wouldn't normally get in the school system, in the schools that they're in. And to help foster that, we actually have students from a wide variety of different high schools. Some are well-to-do, some are not. But just the interaction, I mean, you can watch in the room, just the interaction between the students that are in the lower income schools versus those that are not, and the benefits those students get just from interacting with the other students are tremendous.
So you're having people who are already in their professional career mentoring, working with kids from high schools from a variety of successful schools or not so successful in backgrounds.
Right.
That's
but
action.
We also encourage the students to mentor the students that are coming. We're working with high school students. So 9th graders on through 12th, and a 9th grader who's talking to a 12th grader or an 11th grader who's benefited from the program and has gained some more knowledge, is benefiting even more so than he would otherwise.
Great. We have a number of cards who've come up with questions up here and some suggestions. I'd like to just take some of the actions that were suggested. One is, some of these are just dead on and some are being done. Teach students different languages. Here's an interesting one. Adopt a family so that you can teach each other, teach another family, if you will, and learning together in one nation. So that sense of global, if you will, connection across the nation. Here's a bit of a challenging one, though, directed to Mr. Ritchie and the rest of the panel. You spoke, Mark, to a lack of civility and effective diversity within at least some religious and educational organizations. Could you elaborate upon that a little bit? Are churches and colleges failing us in this challenge to build a democracy in a sound bite era?
I don't really know if I don't have an answer to your question, but what I said was that efforts by our religious community to become more diverse in congregations have been, relatively speaking, a passion of mine since I was a United Methodist volunteer when I was 18 years old, so that's more years than I want to remember. So it's been relatively unsuccessful, and I think this has been the case on most colleges. It is, for me, it's interesting to watch it be successfly pursued in other institutions, and so I'm trying to think about, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And you just mentioned this notion of kind of adopt a family learning, and we've had a family that we've shared meals with for 25 or 30 years, and not that they're super different, but once kids start growing up, then kids have friends and kids have neighbors.
Yeah.
And, it's shocking how much you can learn if you just have dinner together once a week with people with kids. It's shocking. But anyhow, that's something that may be in, for example, congregations, or maybe there's some other things that can be done.
Yeah. To an observation that was made earlier, and Trista, you made this in some ways too, that older structures and organizations in some ways are just not as responsive. And then we get shocked and amazed by Occupy this and the Tea Party that as well. Things came up that no one could have predicted. Here's an interesting observation. The millennial generation graduating from college now is socially and community conscious. They're active and they pose a challenge to their new employers through the old organizations because they don't agree with conventional ways of doing things. That seems true to me in my own experience as well. So there is a sense of energy and purpose coming from the millennials, and I don't know what comes behind the millennials. I'm not sure that I know the type. We haven't named them yet. Somebody will. It's probably on YouTube now as soon as we go on this. But there is something happening that, again, it's almost like the old structures can't handle or contain some of the new energy, if you will, coming through the millennials. And again, Trista, your observation was right on about that. I don't know if anybody else wants to address that. Dana, are you nodding or just agreeing?
Yeah, I'm agreeing. A couple of comments about it. I think it's interesting because there was a study done around slacktivism, which was the term given to people that sort of sit in their chair and they like a cause on Facebook or they sign a petition online. Because there were a lot of assumptions made about slacktivists.
Yeah.
I did not coin that phrase. It was part of the study that was done by Mashable. And actually what they found is that a lot of the assumptions about this group were wrong. You thought, well, they go only so deep and then they're not really engaged. But they found out all these interesting stats that they were twice as likely to tell a friend about a cause. They were 4 times as likely to petition others and fundraise on behalf of something. They were 3 times as likely to attend an event. And so there was a lot of these stats that sort of shifted that. I think what will be interesting, and I don't think, to a nod to like the complexity and ambiguity of it, I don't know that we know yet, is that I think it's become so much easier to do that. There's definitely no question. There was no major in social entrepreneurship when I was in college that I was aware of anywhere, and now that's really prevalent. You have students that are thinking about problem solving and are demanding environments where they're able to do that and come up with solutions. And in large part, I think the way that's connected to education, and I think what we have to see change is that a 20th century way of thinking about educating people is that there's an expert in front of the room that is feeding information, and that that it's going in one direction. And I think what characterizes the 21st century and makes it so unique and such a great opportunity is that really is going both ways, and students are now in a position where they are both the producers and consumers of information in a way that's never been true. So you're almost trying to shift education so that it's facilitating the intake of knowledge and decision making as opposed to that. And I think it relates to it because students coming out of that system have an expectation that their opinions will be respected, that their ideas about change will be honored and valued. And I think we will start to see structures in leadership change. I think we'll start to see some changes in institutions, hopefully for the better. My big question about how that relates to what we're doing is how sustained is that? So the short example I'll give is we worked with a group of students doing a project for Kiva, raising a ton of money through microfinance projects around the world. And we walked into the classroom and we said, okay, well, how many of you can tell us, tell us what poverty is, or how is it different to be poor in a poor country or poor in a rich country? And it was a bunch of blank stares. So there's opportunity there, there's access to information, but that challenge to go further and kind of really critically engage and make sure we're doing the homework is something nobody can do that for you. And I think that's, but I think that that's definitely, it's true. There's some Humphrey students here that are a part of a program that are engaged in that, and you're seeing it everywhere. So. Mm-hmm.
And information without context is just a bit, right? A bit and a byte. And I think what each of you on this panel is doing in your different ways is providing context, so it's not just a bit of information, but it's embedded in something, because it's not just enough to have information. We need to have meaning, we need to have direction, we need to have purpose, and that needs community, and I want to bring this back to the question in front of us that started our evening in a way. What does it mean to be a citizen right now? One of the cards in front of us here is basically saying, you've talked a lot about citizen as only within the realm of a state or this particular nation. Can you talk a little bit more about global citizenship? Is that just a phrase? Is that just a title? Is it just a nice kind of banner headline? Or does it in self imply some level of knowledge and responsibility and engagement that simply being a citizen of Minneapolis or Minnesota does not? My own feeling is it certainly does, but I'd like to have you all speak to that, or any one of you that would like to take this on. Yes? No?
Brian.
Okay.
To talk to the global citizenship.
The president of the college with students from 19 nations would like to speak to this, perhaps.
Well, yes, the answer to your question is yes. The reason that we have students from 90 nations is not simply so that we can say we have students from 90 nations, but because we think that the kind of education that we can provide is different, better, and more relevant because students are every day, not just in their classes, but in their residence halls, in the dining hall, interacting with students from different cultures, from different backgrounds, with different perspectives. And that's how you learn. And I do think, given the kind of world that we live in right now, given the ways in which we communicate, given the particular nature of our challenges, which, as we see every day, cross national borders, they don't end at national borders. Right. I do think, in order to be a responsible citizen now, it does mean having some knowledge of and some sense of responsibility toward the rest of the world, if only out of self-interest. I think if anyone thinks now that success can be determined merely through success within a local community or even a particular nation, the events of the last few years, I think, have proven that to be incorrect. So I do think that being a citizen right now, to an extent that has never been true before, really does mean being a citizen of the world in addition to being a local citizen.
Mm-hmm. Mark, do you want to speak to that? Or okay.
I feel like people have given a lot of thought to this over maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years about, what does it mean? And the earliest writings and the earliest mythological poetry and songs, dealt with what did it mean. And a lot of them dealt with questions of war and going off to war and coming home and a lot of that. But I think in this last 100 years, in particular, we've gotten a little more clear about some aspects of our capacity to destroy the planet if we're not careful. And I think President Eisenhower said the only way to win the Third World War was to prevent it. And he went about the business of creating people to people and to creating international organizations. George Marshall went off to the First World War with General Pershing and came home and said, we can't just go and fight the Kaiser and win the war and then just walk away from it. And so when he was responsible for the U.S. military in the Second World War, he created the concepts and implemented them for our responsibility for the destruction that we were going to do, necessarily going to do. And so there's been a kind of a movement, and maybe it's because we now see our technological capacity to destroy at a very big scale, and that has kind of pushed us to then be more thoughtful. But it seems to me it always comes back to that little bumper strip about, if you want peace, work for justice. And it may be that the secret for binding together some of what seems like disparate points of view is, for the question of justice being one about inequality as a kind of fundamental thing, that we need to tackle that from a justice point of view, and we need to tackle that from a peace point of view. And that when we hear anger, we look underneath that and say, well, what's the fear? What's the disenfranchisement? What are the things under the anger? And that we think about our justice questions from the point of view of peace, and we have the benefit of knowing that if we don't get that right, we'll just wipe out a pretty big chunk of the planet if we're not careful.
We promised we'd end at 8 o'clock. We're just a few minutes away from that. I'm going to ask our panelists, if they will, to end with a phrase or a sentence or, frankly, a sound bite, because this is the sound bite era that we're in. I'm going to give them a minute to think about that. I want to tell you again that the work of the Minnesota Humanities Center is right in the center of exactly the challenges that we are discussing here right now. We're dedicated to the future. We bring the full perspective of the humanities to this question of what kind of life do we want to lead, how are we going to get along with each other, and let's step up and take the responsibility and have the courage, because the future is not a given. We're going to create it, just as this event tonight is an act of creation of our common future. So I want to thank World Savvy Dana for gathering us and hosting us tonight. Brian, I want to thank you for Macalester's role in gathering us and hosting us tonight as well. I appreciate it very much. Mark, I want to thank you for your role in state government, for the leadership that you exercise there, and for being part of our panel tonight. I want to thank you, Trista, for creating justice through your work, for bringing up the questions that you do. Jamal, for the leadership that you express in your corporate world and the global responsibility that you exemplified tonight. Thank you for being part of this panel and bringing your voice to it. And now I would like to offer each of you, if you wish, an invitation, but not an obligation, for a sound bite ending. Who'd like to start? The president would like to start. Excellent.
Sound bites are what I do. I think it's very easy in discussions like this to point fingers at other people, at other institutions, but I think we need to remember that we have the government, we have the institutions that we create and deserve.
Exactly.
And so it's not them, it's us.
Right.
And so if we want different and better institutions, if we want different and better governments, it's our responsibility to create them, not simply to complain about them.
You forgot to mention something about the 90 countries. I would just say that it's your responsibility to give back to those that are coming behind us, teach them how. It's your responsibility. It's your responsibility to give back to those that come behind you, and it's your responsibility to teach them about the way culture is expanding here in the United States, and how we're growing as a global community.
My soundbite, I guess, to build on what Brian said, I couldn't agree more, is to I'm guilty of this as well, but for us all to sort of challenge ourselves for those positions we feel have crystallized for whatever reason, where we don't budge, we don't consider other perspectives, regardless of what they may be, that we sort of, as a personal challenge to us all in the effort to have generosity where there are differences, to sort of put that into practice, because I think that's a small step to creating a little more openness. So
I would just say that democracy isn't a spectator sport. It's something that you have to participate in 100%, and when you do that, you get the results.
And all of this is really for times we shall never see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all very much indeed, and thank each of you for coming out tonight and being part of this. And I think we'll end it.